You might take your Bibles and turn to the book of Titus, chapter 1. Titus 1. We will look there in just a moment. We'll be spending most of our time in the last few verses of Titus chapter 1. It is a wonderful blessing to be here with you today. There are a lot of things that have to happen in order for a service like this to run well, and I believe right now we're running like a well-oiled machine. Now, from here on, a lot of it relies on me, so don't expect anything to run well-oiled, but just the things that it takes to make everything appropriate for us to be able to assemble here, the thought that goes into the preparation that's being made. I think Austin, we were talking Wednesday night about what songs he was going to lead in light of my sermon. So one, I have to know what I'm preaching on that early in the week, and he has to make decisions about the songs, and so I appreciate him doing that, and the reading and the prayer that has been offered. And it's just a wonderful blessing to be here. Aaron had to step out, but when you hear a little baby crying to start off the service, I'm sure it might be frustrating to her to have to manage that, but what a blessing it is to hear a little Ezra crying in the church building, and in addition to that. Let me also make mention, I have noticed lately, Alan and his helpmeet, Anna, if you miss something, almost immediately there's the live or the recording is available in there, and I think it took them a while to get caught up with all of the things that had been missed over time, and now it's within just a day or two. I don't say that to put the pressure on them to always have it in a day or two, but it's just a really handy resource for me who's trying to look back at Bible classes and things like that. It's just so much available on the YouTube channel, and I appreciate the good work they do. And there's so many things to mention that I don't have time, but that was just something that struck me this morning. So we have been looking one lesson a month at the little book of Titus, in Titus chapter, and we have made it to Titus chapter 1, but the end of Titus chapter 1. It's taken me a long time to get through this, and I want you to know, when I do my Luke series, it's going to take because just the first chapter of Luke is longer than the whole book of Titus, so that's going to be my next 25 years. No, I'm just kidding. We've been looking at the theme of the book of Titus as a theme of His grace reaches and teaches me. And when we talk about God's grace, we talk a lot about the wonderful gift that it is and how it brings our salvation. But I think what Paul wants Titus to be clear on, and what he wants him to make clear to his people, the people that he is teaching, that not only does God's grace reach us with salvation, not only does it offer that gift to us, but as he says in chapter 2 and verse 11, that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. Not all will be saved, but the gift's been brought. To all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. That's Titus 2, verses 11 and 12 or so. Now, last time we talked about the important role that elders play in a local congregation. It seems that right at the core of Titus's work, as he is left on Crete, the island of Crete, by the Apostle Paul, is to set in order the local churches by appointing elders over them. And right at the heart of those elders' work, as we read in verse 9, is that they must hold fast to the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to both exhort in sound doctrine and to reprove those who contradict. Right at the heart of the elders' work is to be capable, faithful to God's word, and capable of both exhorting people, building them up in sound doctrine, healthy teaching that aligns with God's word and that is beneficial to the people who hear it because it's so faithful to what God has said, and able to refute those who would come and challenge what God's word has to say. That's what you're looking for, Titus. Those are the kind of men you need. Why? Notice verse 10. I have it up here on the screen, but it may be small print for some of you, so look at your text. I'm reading from the Legacy Standard Translation. He says, "For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of dishonest gain. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. For this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure. But to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their works they deny Him, being detestable and disobedient and unfit for any good work. What I want to do first is just walk through this text, and then we'll make some applications as we draw to a close. Let me say this. This is not a pleasant topic to have to talk about, the idea of false teachers. I am thankful for this moment where we get to talk about false teachers in a situation where I think generally we have peace and unity. That doesn't mean that we're all on the same page about everything, but I don't think we have anybody getting up and declaring things that are false. I don't think we have people trying to subvert families by going around and spreading false doctrines. But even good, solid churches in the New Testament days, what does Paul warn them about? The danger that's coming. And here is Titus, a faithful preacher who's left on the island of Crete, and his great responsibility is to squelch and to get rid of and to have men put in place that will help him fight against false teaching. The day will come where we have to engage with false teaching, where we have to engage with people who are motivated in bad ways. So maybe right now is a good time to talk about that and kind of allow us to take a big dose of what it would mean when we have to face that day so that we're prepared. Because what I want us to see is that His grace reaches and teaches us even in the struggles against false teaching. So notice first, as we work through the text, the word for. For, or because, it's the Greek word gar, means therefore, or in view of that, or because it's a connection to that appointment of elders. What do you want? You want men who are godly men. You want men who have experienced the grace of God, and you want men who are confirmed in the truth of God's word so that you can be prepared for these false teachers that are coming. Now look at how these false teachers are described. First, just in their character. They are described as rebellious. I think that's pushing against the truth that Paul and Titus were teaching. It's not just that they weren't listening to the elders, because there's not even elders everywhere yet. They're rebelling against God, not just some human men. They're empty talkers. Have you ever heard somebody get up and say a lot of words, and then you think about it and you're like, wait, what did they just say? They didn't say anything. They didn't say anything moving or powerful. You can listen to some mega church preachers who will get up and with lots of passion and jumping up and down and waving their arms will say the same phrase over and over again. And you're like, well, what does that mean? I don't know where this is going. And they are deceivers. These men are saying what I believe they know to be false, or at least they know to be in challenge to what the apostles are saying. Now, what does those of the circumcision mean? Well, I've highlighted a couple of other passages in this same text. He also mentions the Jewish myths and commandments of men. And then he makes this reference to the pure, all things are pure, but those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. So we see it referenced throughout this little passage. These are what we would call the Judaizing teachers. Jewish people who obeyed the gospel, I believe. I think they are probably identified as disciples, straying disciples, bad disciples, but they are people who at one point made a commitment to Jesus, I think. But for the Gentiles, that is people of other nations other than the Jews, they say that in order to be a part of God's covenant people, you can't just join in from the outside. You have to step into God's already covenant people, the Jewish nation, and then you can give your allegiance to the Messiah. Then you can give your allegiance to the King. And so they put these cultural boundary markers, these Jewish boundary markers around things, especially like circumcision. See this in Acts 15. I think it's probably a good, helpful text for us to understand well when we're approaching books like Romans, Galatians, Titus. What's the question about? It's about where does the law fit for the Gentiles? Where does circumcision fit? Where do I think when he refers to the pure, all things are pure, where do those food laws from the Old Testament fit? Sometimes we see references to the Sabbath day. You see, the Jewish people thought if you're going to be one of Jesus' people, you have to be one of the Jewish people first. And what had they decided that meant? Well, they had decided that meant circumcision, that meant food laws, that meant Sabbath day keeping, things like that. Now, what I think Paul would say about all of that is that that was never what made somebody one of God's people at its core. What always made somebody one of God's people was their faithfulness to Christ. Consider Abraham. He was God's man before he was ever circumcised. Consider David, who failed in keeping the law, but when he approached God with a humble and broken heart in devotion to him, he was forgiven. God had always had his faithful people were his. He had never imposed things like circumcision or the Sabbath law or dietary laws on the Gentile nations. And this was not the time to start. Because in doing so, and I think this is part of Paul's point in the book of Romans, to demand that Gentiles become Jews first would be to break the promise that he had made to Abraham. Do you remember what God promised to Abraham? That he would bless all nations. He did not say, I will bless everybody who becomes a Jew. That would be blessing one nation. He's saying, I will bless all nations. So you could be from Israel, or you could be from Egypt, or you could be from Turkey, or you could be from Italy, or you could be from Alabama, and you can find the blessings in Christ. You don't have to become a Jew first and then be one of Christ's. You can just be his. So, as we'll notice, the men who are imposing these things, I think, really reduced what it meant to be one of God's people to a few laws they could check off and say, well, I'm in. When really what God always wanted was faithful people. Now, for the Jews, that looked different, and it was for their good. And we can learn lessons from the laws that they were given, including things like circumcision and the food laws and the Sabbath day laws. I don't want to dismiss those things as just arbitrary rules. They weren't. They were for their good. But they were not applicable to Gentiles who wanted to be disciples of Jesus. And as a result, their teaching not only challenged biblical ideas about who God's people are and what it takes to be saved and what the role of the law was, but they also, by their teaching and by their example, just served as models of hypocrisy. Because they had reduced the law to so few things, they thought, well, I got these things handled. And then it almost seems like they felt justified in living in all sorts of other corrupt, horrible ways. And so they're false teachers who are not only getting the information wrong, they're pretending that godliness is just going through a few motions and then living lives that are a lot like the people around them on Crete. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Now, what he says about these people is that they must be silenced. Must be silenced? What about everybody gets to say their piece? What about free speech? What about everybody getting to put their word in? Right? We want to be fair and equitable and give everybody an opportunity to share their word. Not in cases like this. Now, how are they going to be silenced? It's not by punching them in the mouth, right? It's not by violence. How has Paul said to prepare? Titus, you find men who are holding fast to the word of God, who are able to exhort people in sound doctrine, and who are able to contradict false teaching. The way that they are silenced is faithful, godly men get up and they address the issue. Now that sometimes is going to look rough. It's going to look harsh. But what does Paul say? False teachers must be silenced. We don't want to hear that. Now, the great danger in all of this is that they are upsetting whole families. They're upsetting households. Now, I don't know that we have to draw this from the text, but doesn't this kind of point to maybe an undercover approach? You know, they go around to these families and in a private setting, they're introducing these ideas. They're not getting up publicly in the assembly and declaring this because they know that what they're doing is against what's being taught. I want you to consider this. If you think that you have a new view that might challenge the way we've been doing things, what's the right way to approach that? And I'm not saying we have everything right. And I'm not saying that there aren't new views that might challenge the way we do things. I'm on board with that. I want to constantly be replanting God's word and producing whatever fruit that brings. So if you think that we have that view, the problem is not having private conversations. I wouldn't want you to start from a pulpit or a Bible class or something like that in most circumstances. But I'll tell you how I've seen it happen. You assume you're right. And you go around to all the families who you think might be open to what you're saying, or you think even might be vulnerable to what you're saying. Or you go to, maybe you're the young people's Bible class teacher, and you throw the idea out to them. And maybe you have some friends and you start spreading it around and you say, I think we've been missing this, and this is just really where it all is. And, they're not going to like it when we come out with this doctrine, but this is really what's true. And you use your wit, and you use a little bit of agreed upon truth to build some foundations. I mean, you can find circumcision in the Bible, right? There's got to be something good about it. And then you convince them, and you lead them in a direction all under the radar. Now, that's one way to approach a new view. The other way is like this. You could go to the good Bible students. You could go to our elders. And you could say, hey, I've come across this. It strikes me that it might be true. Am I missing something? You don't assume you're right. You see that there are questions that you have raised to you. I have questions about what the role of the law is in our lives. And you go and you say, am I missing something? You see how that's a better way to approach things? It's not that it's not a private conversation. It is. But how are we approaching that? And so I'm not trying to push against one bit you coming across new teachings. There are things that as I've become a serious Bible student over the last several years of my life, I believe that my views on things have changed. But if I'm doing that, if I'm going to publicly teach on that, then I need to be very careful and have that evaluated very carefully so that I'm not being dragged off into false teaching and false doctrine. Now, only one of those kinds of scenarios is somebody who's trying to be on the up and up, right? And make sure that they're doing everything in a good way. But these people are not doing things in a good way because look at their motivation. They are teaching things that are not proper. They're teaching things that they should not because they want dishonest gain. Their teaching is false and their motivation is sinful, so they have every reason to operate under the radar like this. Now notice that the Cretans are described in verse 12. And we've already made mention of this passage and how it describes the culture. But what Paul is saying to Titus is that these false teachers just look like the Cretans they grew up around. They look like the Cretans that they are. And if you've ever heard the word Cretan used as an insult, that started really early on. People for thousands of years, thousands of years have used Cretan as an insult. In fact, it came to mean liar. Right? That's why we use the word Cretan as an insult sometimes. It's because it literally came to mean in the Greek language later a liar. But the nature of the Cretans is reflected in the false teachers. They are liars, just like the Cretans, because they're dishonest. They are evil beasts. They're tearing apart whole households. It's like letting a bull loose in a china shop. They're just going in and ravaging households with this false teaching. And they are lazy gluttons. They want dishonest gain. Now, I don't know how they're gaining. I don't know if it's gaining in financial support from the people that they're converting. I don't know if they're being supported by people in Judea who are trying to get people to turn. I don't know what it is, but they find some way to make money, to make profit off of this whole thing. So what's the right response to teachers like this? Verse 14, we see that the right response to false teachers like this is severe or sharp reproof. Now, it says, so that they may be sound in the faith. Now, what's he saying there? That they should be sound. That they may be sound in the faith. When I first read this, I thought it was talking about the false teachers. You rebuke them sharply so that they may be sound in the faith. That's a good reason. As I looked at it more carefully, I wondered, maybe it's talking about the people they're teaching. You see that in verse 14, that they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments. It's almost like the listeners are being talked about. Why would we rebuke them sharply? So that the people who are hearing them won't be convinced by them. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's so that everybody can be sound in the faith. When he talks about sound, sometimes we might talk about a sound ship. Sometimes if you're filling out a legal document, it will say, I, Plyler, of sound body and mind. Not sure how often I can say that anymore, but, of sound, healthy thinking. Why do we do that? Severe reproof, sharp. I hope so that I can reach the person who's teaching the false doctrine. But they have shown themselves to be animals. So I'm not sure that that's the focus. It's severe reproof so that the people who are hearing them won't be pulled away. If my efforts can reach the false teacher, outstanding. If they can't, I've got people still that I'm concerned about. And the other answer is not just rebuking the false teacher severely, but it's for people not to pay attention to them. Stop listening. Don't give them their time. That's one way to silence people. If you'll quit listening, they will find somewhere else to take all of that. Now, notice in verse 15. I think verse 15 for me was the most difficult of the passages in this text to just understand what it means. But here's what he's saying. To the pure, all things are pure. That is, to people who are morally pure. To people who are devoted to God from the inside out. It doesn't matter if you follow the food laws that these people lay down or not. To the pure people, the people who are morally pure, all things are ritually pure, right? The Old Testament people couldn't eat pork or catfish. If you will be morally pure, you can, and it's just fine. But if you're morally impure, if you are disbelieving, if your heart is not right with God, then you can have the cleanest, most kosher meal on the plate, and it won't benefit you one bit. Do you see what he's saying? To those who are pure on the inside, eat whatever you want. It's not going to hurt you. As Jesus says in Mark 7, it's not what goes into the body that defiles man, but what comes out from the heart. If you're morally pure on the inside, don't worry about these food laws. But if you're not morally what you ought to be on the inside, every meal's dirty. Every bite you take is defiling. Because you are just not what you ought to be. He's saying, I think he's trying to tell them, it has always been about who you are from the inside out, not about just figuring out what goes down your gullet. Right? That's not the big deal. And so these people make a lot of pretensions to be godly people, don't they? If you looked at them from the outside looking in, you would say, you mean these people, maybe some of them are Gentile proselytes. You mean they went through a Gentile circumcision? You mean they observe, they won't eat pork or catfish? You mean they keep the Sabbath day with the strict regulation of the Jewish teachers? You mean they keep all these feast days with such? And you would say, wow, how spiritual they are. But how does Paul describe them? In verse 16, he says, they profess to know God, but by their works they deny Him. The lives that they really live, the lives that you could see if you could pull back the curtain from their public display, is detestable to God. It's an abomination. It's disobedient. And they are unfit for any good work. Not one thing that they do accomplishes good because they are hypocrites. They make all these displays about being God professors. And really what they are is they are deniers. They are detestable, and they're disobedient. One commentator called this verse the hinge verse of the book of Titus. That's interesting. Because what Paul has done is he has set up and said, there's bad stuff, and you got to get ready for that, Titus. These people are not fit for any good work. But look at what he says in the very next verse. Don't let the chapter break fool you. He says, but as for you, right? In contrast to these false teachers, what's a man like Titus supposed to be doing? But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine. That'll be, Lord willing, for the April Titus lesson. So just wait for that. We'll see more about what that means. So you've got Titus, who is called to be a faithful teacher of what does equip people for good work, what does make them fit to be God's people. Not just professors of God, but livers of that devotion that they have to Him. And so I think that's really what the rest of the book of Titus is preparing people. What's really important? Is it circumcision? Is it food laws? No. It's that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, and it's teaching us to deny ungodliness and worldly lust and live soberly, and righteously, and godly in this present age. That's what they need to be concerned about. All right, let's make just a few applications. Sorry, I meant to highlight that. First of all, watch out for false teaching. We're watching. We need to have that on our alert. I would like to read lots of books from lots of different perspectives, and I always go in with radar sensors on high. All right, so if I ever recommend you a book, don't say, well, Plyler agrees with every word of this book. No, maybe there was some benefit. I'm always on the alert for false teaching. I want you to notice that their false teaching seems to have been culturally shaped. What does their false teaching sound like? Sounds like the false teaching Cretan would present, doesn't it? Lies, ransacking houses, overthrowing families, all so they can make dishonest gain. Their teaching, in addition, the Jewish culture that was probably quite prominent on the island of Crete, is influencing them. Where does modern false teaching come from? When we talk about the Bible's teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, and false doctrines that have arisen around that, where does that come from? Does it come from us looking at our Bibles and say, wow, I never saw that there? Or is it a shift and change in the culture? What about false teaching on women's roles in an assembly like this? Where do our changes come from? Does 1 Corinthians 14 read any differently to you than it did 20 years ago? What about 1 Timothy 2? Does it sound different? Not as far as I can tell. Well, what has happened? Rapid changes within the culture. What about teaching on homosexuality? Where 20 years ago, even what we would consider to be liberal people who call themselves disciples of Jesus would have held pretty similar views to you and me on that. And what's happened? Is it because we went to those passages and said, well, that doesn't say what I thought it said? Or does it say that, and then all of a sudden our culture decided that it needed to say something different, and so we figured out a way to work around that? I don't know how you felt when I said those things, but why do I always feel a little bit of a race in my heart when I have to bring those things up? Why does that create a little bit of tension in my mind when I start talking about marriage, divorce, remarriage, women's roles, and homosexuality? Is that because I'm just reading the Bible and letting that soak in my mind, and that's what or is it because I watch the news too, and I'm aware of the culture too, and I feel a little bit of that heart pumping? Because we must be careful that we are not so shaped by the world that when false teaching comes that just says what the world is saying, that we buy in hook, line, and sinker. There is a danger of false teachers being shaped in those ways. But there is a danger of us being so shaped by the culture that we say, you know what, that actually sounds like what I've been wanting to believe for a long time, and I just couldn't find a way around it. Thank you for helping me to find a way to believe that. What about man-made religion? False doctrines on what makes God's people and what it takes to be saved. Whether it's something that imposes something more on others than what God has said. Is it possible that we have traditions and that we have beliefs that would say hold people to a standard that God wouldn't really hold them to? Is it possible that some people take away expectations that God has put in place for what makes somebody part of His people? Is it possible that people change that and make the conditions different so from what God has said is necessary to be saved? We need to be constantly aware at attempts to alter that. And then I think one of the greatest dangers that we see is that these false teachers who are hypocrites. It's a great danger because some people might get the impression from the way some Bible teachers live is that it is just a Sunday go-to-meeting ritual process and it doesn't really affect the way we live. And it doesn't matter what you're saying. If you're not ready to live it, then you're not ready to teach it. I was thinking about this. We have little Ezra here today. I love the passage about Ezra that says that he set his heart to know God's law, to do it, and to teach it to his people. You see the order there? To know it, then to do it, then to teach it. Not know it, then teach it, and maybe we'll get to doing it later. No. You know it first, and then you obey it, and then you become a teacher of it. That serves a hypocritical way of teaching, serves as a terrible example of what being a disciple is all about. I think we need to be careful that we don't let our public, visible worship services become the stand-in for what real faithfulness is. I've not heard anybody in my lifetime preach the necessity for circumcision in order to be saved, or avoiding bacon and catfish. Who would teach such a thing in Franklin County, right? Never heard anybody promote that. But I have heard people act in such a way that the things that which churches of Christ do, which are, I hope that they're right. I hope we're pursuing truth. But they have acted in such a way that that kind of is the marker for what faithfulness is. And there's not been a whole lot of talk about how we ought to live our day-to-day lives. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think the things that we assemble and do here together, not using instruments, taking the Lord's Supper every Sunday, baptizing people for the remission of sins, I think that's what God's Word clearly teaches. But I hope that when I say, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, that I don't reduce it to those things. Because you know what being a disciple of Jesus is? It's being taught that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. Now, devotion to the Lord, I think, will cause us to think very carefully about our public assemblies and the work we do collectively. But it doesn't even start there. It starts with whether you or not you've given allegiance to the King. And so we want to be very careful that our own hypocrisy, we come here and we do the Sunday go-to-meeting stuff, but then we're not devoted to being faithful and just and merciful Monday through Saturday. We don't want that, because that opens us up to accept hypocrites who are Bible teachers, because it might make us feel a little better about ourselves. So let's be careful to test what we're teaching and what we're hearing. I am not saying that I have it all figured out for sure. I'm not saying as a congregation we have it all figured out. I'm not even saying that our elders have it all figured out. But we have a lot of folks here who are striving to be good Bible students. And if there's new ideas, let's evaluate them together. Hold to what's true and abstain from the things which are false. Let me also mention another application is that we need clear and courageous teachers. We need elders who are characterized by the qualities of 1:5 through 9. They are gracious, they are not motivated by dishonest gain, and they're holding faithful to the Word of God. I want men leading me that I know that I can trust their motivations, because that gives me a lot more confidence in their instruction. Because if the guy motivated by dishonest gain is the one teaching me, I'm not sure that I can trust what's coming out on the other end. And so I want to be very careful with who I'm trusting. And so we want elders who are characterized by those qualities. They're not looking for shameful gain, and they are equipped in sound doctrine. We want teaching. I want to be a Titus. I want to be somebody who declares things that help people be sound in the faith, that teaches people how to be ready for good works. And we want Bible class teachers that are equipping our little ones with that in those classes. So we want people who are devoted to sound teaching. And we want a congregation. We all want to be people, as we hear the Word of God being taught, that's ready to receive that teaching, trusting in the leadership that we've been appointed, and committing to testing all teaching and rejecting it when it's false. Now, the final point, and this is just where I wanted to get to with more time left to say it. But I want you to consider how grace motivates severe correction. Now you might say, grace motivating a sharp rebuke? Yes. First of all, because grace itself teaches a different kind of life than the life these men are living. So if I really want to get grace right, I've got to say something when I see lives being lived like this by Bible teachers. And so because it calls me to deny ungodliness and worldly lusts, and they are participating in ungodliness and worldly lusts, and because it calls me to pursue righteousness and sobriety and godliness, and they are not, grace itself would call me to teach them that. But most of all, in this case, I think we are shaped by our love, by God's grace for those who are being overthrown. Grace, a recognition of the wonderful gift of God and the high calling to which we are called, moves us to sharply rebuke people who would cause you to lose that. So I may get up here and I may denounce some false teaching, and you may say, well, you came down pretty hard on that. And I say, I know people whose faith has been overthrown by that. I know people who are lost today because this false teaching got a hold of their hearts. Or I know your children, and I'm afraid of the false teaching that is going to be presented to them on these issues. And grace moves me to sharp rebukes for those things. It may mean that it gets a little squirrely when somebody comes here and preaches or teaches, and we don't think it's right. The elders don't think it's right. I hear something. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do my very best to approach it in an Aquila and Priscilla sort of way. You know what that means. Apollos here is a wise man, gifted teacher, but he doesn't know the whole story yet. So when he's preaching and Aquila and Priscilla see this huge gap, they don't make some kind of public demonstration and protest apostolic Apollos is teaching. I don't know how to say Apollos is teaching. They don't protest it. What they do is they take him to the side and they show him more clearly what he's missed. And Apollos repents. It's all good. But how would we react in today's world with being taken aside by a godly man and woman and saying, hey man, I know you're well-trained, probably more well-trained in public speaking than we, the tent makers, are, but we don't think you have the full story here and we'd love to show you. I feel like somebody who had the level of education that Apollos had, if he lived in 21st century America, would probably say, who are you to tell me? Not Apollos. Apollos didn't do that. Apollos said, I see that. And he began to proclaim it. Now, we might think, well, that's a little ugly on Aquila and Priscilla's part to go and correct him like that. But it wasn't ugly. Because then Apollos becomes a tremendous benefit to the work, not only there, but in other places where souls are able to be drawn closer to God because of his work. You see how grace moves them? Love for Apollos, love for God's word especially, devotion to it, and love for the people that are going to be influenced by Apollos. But it also might mean public correction. We see this in the epistles. Specific people called out by name because of the false teaching that they're involved in. Is that where I want to start? No, it is not. But if I know that somebody's having influence among us who is teaching false doctrine, don't be surprised that I don't get up and say, so-and-so is preaching this false doctrine, and here's why that's wrong. Now, you might say, how nasty. And I will say, it's gracious. It's motivated by my love for you. I would love to have a public discussion with him. I would love to have a private discussion with him. But if I can't get to him, if I can't convince him, that doesn't change my obligation to silence him. You see that? Somebody says, well, why don't you address that with him? It's been addressed. If Apollos doesn't stop missing it, what do Aquila and Priscilla do? I think Aquila gets up the next Sunday service and says, look, we talked to Apollos, but he's missed it here. Right? There comes a time where even though our concern for the teacher doesn't fade one bit, our concern is limiting his influence, ultimately. And that may include calling out the teaching or calling out the lifestyle so that no more households are overthrown. I am very thankful to be able to preach this lesson at a moment where I don't think anybody in here thinks I'm putting them out. But oh, for the courage to stand up when the day comes where you have to call me out, because I'm probably the person who's in the primary position of needing to be in this situation. I'm not one of the elders, and I'm involved in a lot of the teaching. When the day comes where you and your wife have to take me aside, or just you have to take me aside, okay? I hope you have the courage to do that. I hope I have the humility to accept it. Or if the day comes where you say, we can't be supporting him. We can't be holding up his hands. He can't be teaching with us. Oh, for the courage for you to stand up to me in that moment. And so I don't want to take the application too far away from myself, because I'm sure there's places where I've missed it. And people have helped me along the way to correct it as I go. But if the day ever comes where my life doesn't match my teaching, or my teaching doesn't match God's word, he must be silenced. He must be sharply rebuked. And I pray that day that I don't view it as hatred or meanness or judgmentalism, but grace. It's teaching me to live and teach in a different way. Well, that's the lesson for this morning. If you are here and you want to make the commitment to be a faithful disciple of Jesus, what I'm calling you to is not a devotion to Plyler. I'm not calling you to a devotion to the Quinn Church. I'm calling you to be devoted to Christ. And no matter what happens in the coming years, maintain that devotion to Christ. And when false teaching arises from my mouth or somebody else's, maintain the devotion to Christ. Because His grace, not mine, has reached you. And His grace, not mine, is the ultimate teacher about how to live, to be a people who are zealous for good works and prepared to meet Him on that final day. If we can help you be sound in the faith and fit for good works, we want to. Make your need known while we stand and while we sing.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.